I speak at the truth.
So good afternoon again. I'll try to be brief. After lunch is always a difficult speaking slot. I don't know if Wesley knew, but I also sit on the MCC as a board member of the current MCC. And as he said, we are in transition. We're trying to get the organization back on its feet and in its rightful position in the industry. So I trust that we will move quickly on that and get us to the place where we ought to be. I want to commend Wesley really on the paper he did. I had a read of it at 4 o'clock this morning, Wesley. And I think it was well written, and I agree with most, if not all, of the views expressed there. It was very interesting that foundation of the pyramid that he referred to of no regulation reminded me of what the framers of the American Constitution put in there when they spoke about freedom of the press and freedom of expression. And after they spoke about the fact that, nobody should basically infringe on freedom of the press and expression, etc. This is what they said: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech and of the press. And what was very interesting about that is that they not only enshrined it in their constitution, they then enshrined another law in the constitution that says, don't touch this law. So do not interfere with the law that says freedom of the press and freedom of expression is enshrined in the constitution. So it is forever there and cannot be touched. And that's how much they valued and cherished this freedom. And as Wesley said, we have it also enshrined in ours, freedom of the press in particular. But that freedom inevitably, creates tension with state institutions. And I'll tell you why. But before I get there, I really want to tell you a story, because I think we can't talk regulation unless we talk about the role and the power of the media and professional development in particular. And I just really want to touch on those issues before I wrap up. I won't be long, I promise. But we, at COSTATT, a member of the media came to us wanting to be hired as a lecturer. I won't tell you from what organization, but she had 8 years experience in the media, like some of you sitting here today. And I was on a panel along with Earl Bess, who some of you would know as a former editor himself. I also worked, as you know, in the media. And we had one other person on the panel. So she was part of the interview process. Is you have to, teach on a topic, show us how you would perform in the classroom after we ask you all your questions about your career, etc. So she had done quite well at that. And we came around to some question time, and I asked her, what she thought about the term, the fourth estate. And she stared at me completely blank. She stared at the panel completely blank. And we counted. It's about 30 seconds, no answer. And then she started to mumble something about, and this is no joke, about a coconut estate in Toco. And that was as horrific as it was funny to us at the time. Of course, she was struck off the list, but immediately. But this was a practicing journalist. What disturbed me most was that this was a practicing journalist, a well-known person in the media. And she talked, when we asked about the fourth estate, she referred to a coconut estate in Toco. It's not Rhea. Rhea is one of our students. She would never do that, right? So the person is not in the room. So I can tell that. And it troubles me up to today, and it's something close to my heart, as I mentioned yesterday, about the issue of training and professional development. Because if we talk in regulation and self-regulation, the only reason that topic is coming up is because somebody or somebodies are troubled by what the media does, right? Or what the media does. So that we have to talk about this topic for a few minutes before I move on. If you don't know who you are, then you can be easily defined by someone else. Yes, you would agree with that statement. If you don't know who you are, you can be easily defined by someone else. And if you don't know the power you hold and what it is to be used for, it will be either misused by you, or taken away from you. If you don't know the power you hold and what it is to be used for, it will either be misused by you or taken away from you. And that is the tension that we have whenever we come to these issues of regulation and the interaction between social institutions and the media. One theorist said the media becomes a central problem for all social institutions, particularly political institutions. Why is that? I want to give you just two definitions that in a paper I wrote about the role and power of the media. And essentially, the power of the press arose from the ability, or your ability, to give or withhold publicity. That's part of the power you hold. And your informative capacity, your ability to tell people what to think about, what are the issues of the day, right? So, this is one definition by one theorist. He said the media is an agency of information and debate that facilitates the functioning of a democracy. And you will see in both definitions, the issue of the democracy is at center stage all the time. The democracy, right? So we facilitate the functioning of democracy. A free media can brief the electorate, as we heard yesterday, assist voters to make an informed choice at election time, provide a channel of communication between governments and the governed, and they provide a forum of debate in which people can identify problems, propose solutions, etc., and reach some consensus. So that's one role, the informative role, the ability to provide that forum for debate and reaching a consensus. But this is the role I believe that gets us into trouble. Another theorist pointed out that the principal democratic role of the media is to act as a check on the state. As a check on the state. It's described as, Wesley alluded to, the free market watchdog role. This role is set to override all other roles of the media, to inform, to entertain, etc., etc. And this theorist argued that the preservation of the democracy is paramount, and therefore the media's role in preserving it via publication of accurate and contextualized information is critical, in so much that their role is not that of a passive conduit of information, just he, she said, type of reporting only. It's not just a role of this passive conduit of information, but also that of an advocate. And this is where we start to get in trouble, because the media does have an advocacy role. And first of all, I was sent by the U.S. Embassy on a tour of the U.S. last year to look at investigative journalism in the U.S. on the ground. I was really impressed because I came back saying that the major networks really deceive us of the state of journalism in the U.S. You see the Fox News, the CNN, and whatever. And when you get on the ground, like I did, and we hopped across 5 different states looking at investigative journalism on the ground and how they were functioning and how they use the Freedom of Information Act, etc., to pull stories out of nowhere and pull stories that people wanted to hide, I realized that journalism on the ground in the U.S. was very much alive and well. And it spoke to a number of issues, all the funding issues, and a lot of these investigative companies and reporters and band of journalists were being funded really by just benevolent people, these super rich people that, had interest in journalism and seeing it succeed. So they were really able to advocate. And we went to, in our last state, we were in Colorado, we went to this media organization, and there was this whole debate. They had no answers for us, but it was just a debate, really. They were now taking the advocacy role outside of the newsroom. They were not only championing the cause of some issue that they felt was important to the community. They wrote these stories, published these stories, then they went to and held town meetings about these stories. And they looked somewhat like a political party almost. And there's a debate even among them. Are we going too far? But that's what is happening in journalism. The boundaries are just expanding with new media, etc., and all these things, boundaries are expanded. So there is this advocacy role, but once you step into that role, then here comes the state, essentially, right? You pose a problem for the state. And then he suggests that the media is mandated to monitor the full range of state activity, monitor it, and fearlessly expose abuses of official authority. That is a role and function of a free press. And that if whenever we take up this role, and I'm saying that we should, and we should always bear this at the forefront, and not be thinking just about coconut estates and whatever, and he say, she say, when we take up these kinds of roles, then you have to be prepared then to really engage in issues of regulation and self-regulation, because they're going to come at you, and they're going to be waving that at you. Time to regulate the press. And you have to be able to defend yourself. And to do so, you must at least have some clear idea and knowledge. And this is from the top down, from media owners, right down to the lower level reporters, of who you are and what is your role. So, you know, the phrase was coined by Edmund Burke, a politician in British Parliament, I believe it was, who, there was this big debate going on in Parliament about the executive arm, the legislative arm of the state, and the judicial arm. And he looked up at the press. I remember when I used to report, we were in the Red House then, Richard, and the old press was in the balcony, we were in the balcony. And so it was similar to that, and he looked up at the balcony, and he says, there's another estate of power that we are oblivious to, and we are not taking on board in our debate. They are sitting up in the balcony. That's where the phrase was coined, the fourth estate. And he put it on the same foundation with the executive, the legislative, and the judicial arm. In other words, these are four pillars of the democracy. And just as the three are just as strong as they are and important they are as to upholding our democracy, so is a free press in upholding our democracy. And the day and the time that one of those three arms try to cut the legs off of the fourth pillar of the democracy is crumbling. And then that fourth pillar must respond. And what I've often seen in recent times is that, of course, as Wesley alluded to, the state raises an issue, and the press just responds by freedom of the press, freedom of the press. But what I like about Wesley's paper and forums like this is that we're taking it a little deeper. We have to entrench these things, you know, and what the TTPBA is hoping to do with the MCC, etc. It must be entrenched and must speak from a position of knowledge. You all say knowledge is power. We must speak from a position of knowledge, and that knowledge must give us the authority to speak. And speak like we know who we are and what we are about. And that is where my heart is, because I've seen a deterioration of professionalism in newsrooms. I'm going to pinch you a little bit because it's after lunch. I just don't want you to fall asleep. But some deterioration of the professionalism in newsrooms. And I'm saying once we get to these issues of regulation, then we must treat with professional development in the newsrooms. So the concept of a free press as an independent political institution in the state developed rapidly from time immemorial in all democracies. In fact, the US said, their founding father said, it is a self-evident truth, you know, they like that phrase, right? A self-evident truth that democracy is unobtainable without and only sustained by a vibrant and free press. And it was Thomas Jefferson, I believe, one of the early presidents, who hated reporters. If he saw you, he would spit on you. The man detested reporters. But he said, if I had a choice between a democracy without a press or the press without a democracy, something like that, bottom line, he was saying, I would choose a world to live in with a free press. Right? And this man hated reporters, but he understood the importance of a free press as a pillar of a vibrant and well-established democracy. So regulation issues, I'm saying, must be examined against the backdrop of our roles and rights, because, as you rightly pointed out, this must be examined against the backdrop of the Constitution and what the Constitution says about freedom of the press and freedom of expression. So it must be examined and talked about in the context of our roles and rights as well as our professional development. So I just want to touch, you know, there are different levels, and I think Wesley's paper went into some of it. There is talk about the administrative regulation, and that's where you get into broadcast and the spectrum and who should get what where, etc. But the real tension comes when we talk about regulating content, right? Regulating content. That's a major tug-of-war between the media and political institutions. Anytime they talk about regulating content. So always been tempting to governments. No matter, I mean, the governments change, but it's just that carrot on the stick to governments to interfere with this freedom. Obviously, because of that role that I referred to earlier, to be a check on the state. And any reporter that picks up that function and the role to be an advocate or to be a check on the state. And this is the role that is often misunderstood or not understood at all by politicians. They don't realize that it's part of the media's role to act as a check on the state to preserve the democracy. And you have to make that known and make it known well, right? You are not anti-government. You are just picking up your function as part of the fourth estate. So invariably, we clash with governments because they are envious of this space, right, that the media is in to influence public opinion and shape public opinion. And you have enviable space. We know that. So they try to bring the big stick down and, and try to influence in that way. But the more dangerous one are the subtle messages, that slip in that to drive their self-centered agendas. And Wesley spoke to something I really wanted to bring home as well, because on the flip side, when we see the state come in to interfere with the freedom of the press and with state intervention and regulation, etc., the cry from the other end is leave it alone. Just like in economics, let the free market operate. The term in economics, the invisible hand, for those who did economics. Leave it alone. Let the invisible hand shape things up. But there's a little danger in there we must be aware of as well. And he pointed it out. We have the public interest argument at hand and the private interest argument. And when we understand the public interest argument that the governments use, this is for the benefit of all, this is to protect the children, this is to protect this and that, but they're slipping in their little agendas and trying to manipulate. And I think most media workers recognize that, and we raise the red flag. But you see the private sector agenda, when we say leave it up to the free market, media is not journalism. Media is also business. And media in the modern times have become big business. Media is big business, particularly when we get these conglomerates and we get these conversions. Since my days in the newsroom under Craig Reynolds at the Express, we were talking about conversions. Make TV6 and Express and bring on all the online platforms and make it one, and you would be paid one salary and pack your video camera at the time, your still camera, your notepad, everything, and report. Conversions is still getting there. So it's big business. There are big dollars in it, the advertising dollars. And there's a fear there on that other side. Because when you get these big conglomerates, then you have private sector, small groups, sometimes individuals like Rupert Murdoch, etc., that hold all the same power in their hands. And the democracy is also threatened by private sector interests. And little us, we, the ordinary reporters in the newsrooms, are the ones charged with the responsibility to defend this space and to uphold this pillar of democracy. So it's a role and function that we cannot take lightly. We cannot dismiss as this is my job. We know we don't be paid well, etc., etc. But when it comes to this charge that we have been given by the Constitution, this charge that we have been given by signing up to be the reporter in whatever newsroom, then we must take it seriously, right? So when we talk about issues of self-regulation, we must talk about it against that backdrop and with that in mind. There are profit-driven enterprises, as this has been said before, and I wasn't here earlier, but I understand it was talked about, with advertising being their primary source of income. So that is a challenge that we must face, because whoever dominates the management of this critical resource called the media gets the upper hand in what we call in media theory the public sphere. The grabbing for the attention of the public, right? And by extension, they are shaping their opinion and getting them to dip in their pockets. So it isn't just a matter of the media maintaining their freedom and independence by warding off attempts at censorship in its various masquerades of state intervention. For even if that is accomplished, the question still arises, is the media truly free? Significant sections of the world media has been taken over by major industrial and commercial concerns, giving rise to no-go areas in reporting, where journalists are reluctant to tread for fear of stepping on corporate toes in their sister companies. And particularly in Trinidad, we have this whole issue of interlocking directorships. So the director on your board is also a director on that company's board that you chase in a story. And I remember as a young reporter and editor, I was very insulted by it. Told me, as I was heading out our story, and which Ken Gordon was involved, that remember who butters your bread. Right, and be careful how you report. And for a young reporter, I hadn't had my master's or anything yet in media, but I found that I was read. I thought I was well read, at least on media issues. I found that very insulting, and coming from an editor. And if you have to face that in your own newsroom from your editor, then what are we leaving from the coming from the outside sources? What are you leaving the reporters? How are you equipping the reporters to deal with it? So again, I'm saying all that to say thanks to people like the ACM and the TTPBA and you who came out today to participate in workshops like these, because they are critical. They are critical in understanding your role and function and what do you do when you leave this place. So I'll end with this part before I just touch on the ethics. Media freedom can give rise not just to guardians of democracy, to borrow a phrase from The Guardian, but to media mercenaries bent on achieving their own self-serving commercial interests. It's something we have to guard against as well. So having said that, how many ever read the MCC Code of Conduct? Anybody? It's something you should make yourself familiar with, to be redrafting it and working on it and trying to include all the new media issues in it, because as you well know, it's developing rapidly, and now you get stories off of Twitter and Facebook, etc. But just to highlight, it treats with issues like accuracy and how you should, of course, we know that's a foundation of all types of reporting, be accurate. How you deal with commenting, opinion pieces, privacy issues, because that's always the cry. You know, it's this freedom of expression and the press enshrined in the institution, but the trick comes in when we have the other rights. How do you protect other citizens' rights, given this freedom of expression, right? And then we have the right to privacy and all of that. So the code tries to address that, to keep the regulators away. We say, let's do it internally. Let's establish this code, and this code is a code that all media owners bought into, all media companies bought into. Well, not all, but most, right? Who said, we agree to this code and we'll abide by this code. So we treat with issues of privacy and how far do you go. I remember I ran an internship for a year and a half at the Express. Some of the great reporters sitting in the room right now passed through that internship. But I remember while we were running that internship, some of the interns came back to me one day and said, we got this story and we got the picture of the man who was killed. How you got it? Well, we see his door open. We push the door open. We went inside. We take the man's photo ID and we walk out. I said, if the police come and lock your skin up, I will not be defending you. Because yes, I told you, push the boundaries and go after the story and whatever. I was an investigative journalist myself. I pushed many boundaries. But you see that? You just broke the law. And if they lock your skin up, I'm not defending you. Get the picture back inside the man's house, and hopefully you won't be caught going back inside. And then come back and we'll talk. I still pass him on the internship. He's a good reporter now. He's not in the room. He's not in the room. But there are these boundaries, and I'm saying these are things that must be internalized and dealt with internally. We shouldn't have them people. You see, these are the things that when we do wrong, then we have the regulators outside saying, you see why we need regulation? So we treat with issues of privacy, clandestine methods of getting information, how we treat with hospitals. I was a health reporter for quite a while myself, and we sneaked into hospitals and got photos and all of that. But the code says, you ought not, right, to do it. Misrepresentation, etc. Harassment, I'm just hitting the highlights. Payment for articles, that's a big no-no. Intrusion into grief and shock. I was a crime reporter. I had the privilege to work across several beats. And I just couldn't stand it as a crime reporter to see my colleagues from other media houses run up to somebody weeping and wailing at their loved one just died and say, name, address. The intrusion into grief and shock, how we treat with matters like that. What we often did, some of us, we roll up our notepad and we put it in our pocket. We sat next to the victim's family on their couch and we empathized for a while. It took time, yes. We were on deadline, yes, but we had to do it. And then we got the story. So the code speaks to issues like that, innocent relatives and friends, interviewing or photographing children. These stories are stuck in my mind. Some of the older reporters would remember the case where I think it was in South or Central, where that boy was kept in a cage by his parents for months and months. He was kept in this cage. And when the reporters happened to be on the scene very quickly when the police rescued him, but there was one photographer who got there late. And you know what he did to get it? We saw the photo was on the front page the following day, and then the story came out after. That he asked or coerced the family to put that boy back in the cage for a few moments to take the photo. The photographer is not in the room. So, and they put the boy back in the cage. You could imagine the trauma. The boy was kept like a monkey. Yeah? He spoke, he had no language skills, nothing. And that photographer put the boy back in the cage to get his photo. There must be some limits and boundaries. Those are the things that bring the regulators knocking on the door with the baton, or the AK-47 sometimes. Children in sex cases, how we treat with that, the code addresses that. Victims of crime, discrimination, financial journalism. I left the media. My last role was as editor of the Express Business. And this is another big issue, the financial journalism side of things, because we have issues of insider trading. You get information as a reporter and matters to it, and they went to jail for it. So the major issue yet in Trinidad, but it's a potential issue, and we try to address it in the code using information to get rich on FCB shares. Thankfully, wasn't a media person. How you treat with confidential sources. Right? In fact, and that speaks to a moral obligation to protect confidential sources of information and not slip them out to somebody because you find out from your fellow reporter who was the source, and then you slip it out to your political source because he was trying to find out from you in the newsroom because he couldn't go directly. Well, I'm not sure what operates in the newsroom now, but I know we used to sit next to each other, and you would never know who my source is. You read my story in the paper the next day. And that's how we treat it with sources, right? So keep it very confidential. I want to wrap up with just touching on this thing because we are trying, I brought it to the MCC, and we're trying to get it in. It's the Code of Ethics of the Society of Professional Journalists. And you should follow them on Twitter or something like that. We've met some of them. It's a really good code. We use it at COSTATT. Huh? Yeah, we use it at COSTATT to teach our laws and ethics class. And I really find it a very good code. And it's founded on a 4-tier foundation, to put it that way. I can't go into all of it, but just Google it. You'll find the code. It talks about seeking truth and reporting it. That's the first tier of the foundation. And that speaks to your role and function. Seek the truth and report on it. And Wesley spoke about that as well. You have that right. Go after the truth, right? Regardless. Always question sources, motives, etc., etc. You can read it up when you get a time. The second part is to minimize harm. So just on one hand, as we have that command almost to go after the truth and report on it, seek to minimize harm as well, right? And that part of the code speaks to showing compassion for, the less fortunate in our society, etc., etc., etc. And we are humans, we are not robots, right, as reporters. Act independently, the third foundation. Act independently. Journalists should be free of obligation to any interest other than the public's right to know. Should be free of any obligation other than the public's right to know, avoid conflicts of interest, etc., etc. Disclose unavoidable conflicts. I just want to go back to the seeking truth part. There is a part there I thought I should mention, which is the public does have a right to know as much as possible about your sources that you can divulge. Right? So just to know that you're not making it up like some of our colleagues across the different parts of the world. And finally, be accountable. Right? Be accountable. Journalists are accountable to their readers, listeners, viewers, and to each other. Clarify and explain news coverage and invite dialogue when possible. Encourage the public to voice grievances against the news media. We should toughen up a little bit to take some criticism when we can, because there's the business we're in, and it should be a policy, and I think it is in most newsrooms, that we apologize when we get it wrong. We say we got it wrong and we apologize. And take your licks when you get it. Like a recent publication that got licks for a story. And I mentioned that. Anyway, admit mistakes and correct them, expose unethical practices of journalists and the newsroom. Well, that one I think happens. We turn on our own very viciously sometimes, and that says that we're doing well. When we turn our own, don't get on the wrong side of your colleague sitting right next to you. I tell you, they will expose you. Abide by the same high standards to which you hold others. Abide by the same high standards to which you hold others. So I trust that I gave you some food for thought and that I kept you awake. It's a few pinches. And it really was a pleasure being here and just seeing old colleagues again and meeting some new colleagues, even neighbors. I found out somebody is my own neighbor. What does that say of me, of our neighborhood? All right? But where's that? He's in this room. But thanks. It was great being here.